I had to reunite my family to inherit everything, but the truth changed everything. Reddit stories. They say families are like trees. Branches may grow in different directions, but they all share the same roots. Mine, though, had roots that twisted in the dark, silently splitting rock and trust beneath the surface. On paper, we were tight-knit Sunday dinners at my grandfather's estate, yearly holidays at the lake house, and an endless stream of well-curated photographs that lived on the walls of our ancestral home. But beneath the varnish of tradition and legacy, something older and colder churned, something that had been buried long before I was born. I only started to notice it after my father's accident, the one that changed everything. That autumn, when the leaves fell like ashes and the light seemed permanently tinged with amber, was when the mask of our family began to crack. It was sudden, violent, and, to this day, I'm not sure if it was a stroke of fate or the delayed consequence of a century-old secret clawing its way to the surface. My father, Jonathan, was the second eldest of 4 siblings. My uncle Malcolm, the eldest, carried himself like a general retired from war. Rigid, measured, and indifferent. Aunt Claudia, always the voice of reason and guilt, balanced a veneer of grace with barely concealed bitterness. And then there was Uncle Ellis, the youngest, the wild card, who floated through life with a cocktail in hand and a smirk that hinted he knew far more than he let on. After my grandfather's passing, the balance between them shifted like tectonic plates, unseen but inevitable. At the time I was 29, recently divorced, and living in the guest house at the far end of the estate. I told myself it was temporary, but I think I always knew I'd be pulled back in. My father's death, car crash, no witnesses, clean break failure, didn't sit right with me. I didn't say that out loud, not then. People don't like you questioning the universe while they're still wiping tears on linen handkerchiefs. The will was the first spark. My grandfather, Lionel Carrington, had built an empire from textiles in the post-war boom, but it was his investment acumen that turned modest wealth into generational fortune. We knew there would be clauses. He had a flair for theatrics even in legal documentation. But what none of us expected was the specific, cruel poetry of it, the estate, the businesses. The entirety of the family trust would pass not to the eldest, not to a committee, but to the first grandchild who could prove they had truly united the family. Not just a dinner or a reunion. No, genuine, visible, public reconciliation as evaluated and documented by a neutral party. The clause read with the smug finality of a ghost's whisper. There were 10 of us grandchildren scattered across cities, countries, and ideals. Some I barely knew, some I actively avoided, but the clause had a deadline. 1 year from the day of his funeral. Suddenly, we were all players in a game we hadn't agreed to enter, with the entire fortune on the line and emotional ruin as the entry fee. At first, I dismissed it. I had no interest in dragging skeletons from closets or convincing cousins I hadn't spoken to in a decade that love was thicker than suspicion. But then I discovered the journal. My father's, leather-bound, hidden behind the false panel in his study. It was meticulously organized, dated, and damning. Entry after entry chronicled late night meetings, veiled threats, sudden changes in investment portfolios, and, most chillingly, warnings about Malcolm. He knows, one entry read, scribbled and underlined in desperate ink. I found the letter in Mother's trunk. If he reads it, he'll burn everything. Claudia's silence can't hold. Ellis suspects, but he won't act. I'm the only one left who remembers why this family shouldn't be whole. I read those words under lamplight, my hands trembling, as if I'd accidentally summoned something from beneath the estate. The inheritance clause wasn't just a test. It was a fuse. That winter, I began attending the family's weekly brunches again. I watched them carefully, like a detective embedded among suspects. Malcolm was already maneuvering, hosting private gatherings, flaunting his perfect grandchildren like trophies. Claudia turned her focus to genealogy, dragging long-lost cousins into video calls and forming family healing committees with the tone of a principal about to scold a roomful of children. Ellis, oddly, did nothing, until I confronted him. I remember that moment more vividly than the day my father died. We sat in the conservatory, surrounded by dead orchids and antique vases. I asked him about the letter. His face, for the first time in my life, lost its amused detachment. "You shouldn't go digging in graves," he said. "Some roots poison what they touch." Then he laughed too loudly and left the room. I didn't sleep that night. Days turned to weeks, and subtle manipulations blossomed like fungi in the dark. I started receiving anonymous emails, scans of documents, unsigned notes with phrases like "Ask Claudia about 1972" or "The bastard clause isn't just legal." I didn't understand half of it, but the more I read, the more I realized the inheritance wasn't meant to bring us together. It was designed to expose us. Each sibling, each cousin, each in-law. Everyone was hiding something. Old betrayals, illegitimate connections, violence. Even now, I can't say which truths were real and which were planted, but the effect was the same. Paranoia bloomed like mold across our family tree. Meanwhile, I dug deeper into my father's journal, tracing patterns, building timelines. It became my obsession. And then I found the tape. It was tucked into the back cover of the journal, labeled in my father's handwriting, "For the one who finally sees." My hands shook as I played it. His voice was calm but frayed around the edges. "If you're listening to this, I'm likely dead, and if I'm dead, it wasn't an accident." My breath caught. Malcolm found the original letter, the one from grandmother. She wasn't just some socialite married into old money. She was the daughter of Lionel's business partner. Illegitimate, hidden from public view. The estate? Everything was supposed to pass to her line. To me, that clause, the one about reconciliation, it's a lie. It's a decoy. Malcolm had it inserted to stall the true transfer. The real documents are in the chapel wall, bought static. Then, tell Ellis he was right to be afraid. And tell Claudia she was never just the sister. The recording ended with the sound of distant footsteps and a creak like a door opening. I rewound it 5 times, trying to catch anything else. Nothing. The chapel on the estate grounds had been sealed since before I was born, its windows boarded and doors bolted with rusted chains. We called it the mausoleum, a relic from some pious great-grandfather's era of architectural grandeur. Now I wondered what else it had intoned. That night, I walked to the chapel under a veil of fog. The key, inherited with the guest house, slid into the ancient lock like it had been waiting. Inside, the air was thick with dust and secrets. Behind the altar, I found a loose stone. Beneath it, a metal box. Inside the box, 3 items: a photograph of my grandfather with a woman I'd never seen before, a letter with a seal bearing our family crest, and a birth certificate with my father's name and another parent listed, not my grandmother, but the woman in the photo. My mind reeled. That meant he was the rightful heir. That meant Malcolm had known. That meant the clause, the whole game we'd been forced to play, was smoke and mirrors. I should have told someone. I should have gone to the lawyers, exposed the lie, restored the legacy. But I didn't. Not yet. Because just then, I realized something else. The clause had never been meant to unite us. But maybe, just maybe, it could destroy them. And in the ashes, I could rise with everything they thought they'd protected. I smiled for the first time in weeks, clutching that letter like a match ready to strike. Let the reconciliation begin. That winter was cruel, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and stayed there like regret. The estate felt different now. Less like a home and more like a stage, each room lit for some silent performance, each actor waiting for their cue. I kept the contents of the chapel box hidden, tucked beneath a loose board under my bed. I knew that once I played my hand, it would have to be the final one. Until then, I had to move like smoke, seen but never grasped. I began with the photograph. The woman beside my grandfather wore a red coat, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her eyes carried something unreadable, pride maybe, or defiance. I had the photo digitized and ran it through a facial recognition tool under a pseudonym. Within days, I had a name, Evelyn Mortimer, deceased 1983. No surviving children listed, no obituary published. But one detail stuck out. Her last known address was in the city where my father had attended university. A coincidence. In our family, coincidence was usually just conspiracy with better manners. I took a day off from the farce of Sunday brunch and drove to the address. It was a modest apartment building, now converted into boutique condos, all polished brass and scented lobbies. The manager, a man with suspiciously white teeth, humored my story about archival research, long enough to pull a tenant ledger from storage. Evelyn Mortimer had lived in Unit 6C for 13 years. She paid in cash. No emergency contacts, no lease renewals. And then 1 month after my father's graduation, she vanished. Not moved, not died, vanished. I knew then that whatever had happened between her and my grandfather wasn't a fling. She had been hidden deliberately. Protected or erased? I couldn't tell which. Back at the estate, Claudia had started organizing what she called legacy evenings. Every Thursday, we were expected to gather in the great room and share memories of love, loss, and lineage. I thought it was idiotic. But when I saw Malcolm's tight smile and Ellis pouring gin into his teacup, I realized I wasn't the only one suspicious. Claudia was probing. Every story told became a thread she traced backward. I watched her scribble notes after every session, her pen gliding like a scalpel. On the third evening, I offered my own story. I described a summer trip to the coast, one I knew Malcolm hadn't attended. I invented a detail. My father falling ill after eating bad oysters, Ellis taking care of him all night. I waited. Ellis blinked, then nodded along. But Malcolm corrected me, said it was Claudia who had stayed up with him. I smiled. The memory was fake. And Malcolm's insistence proved he hadn't just lied. He remembered something that hadn't happened. He was manufacturing family history. That was my first real leverage. Over the following weeks, I started feeding the family lies. Just small ones, deliberately inconsistent. I told one cousin that Ellis had confessed to bribing their college admissions officer. I told another that Malcolm had once tried to move family assets offshore in secret. I even hinted to Claudia that I'd found letters. Plural, not just the one. And that some of them implicated her in a cover-up involving a trust fund that mysteriously disappeared in the 90s. I didn't accuse. I suggested. Whispers, sideways glances, and half-finished sentences did the rest. The Carringtons had always been more vulnerable to implication than accusation. It wasn't guilt that haunted them. It was the fear of being seen. Meanwhile, I had the birth certificate authenticated. It was real. The seal matched official documents from the time. My father had been born Jonathan Mortimer, changed by legal adoption 2 years later. My grandmother, well, the woman I'd always believed to be my grandmother, had signed the adoption papers. She knew. She had taken in a child that wasn't hers and raised him under the Carrington name. That made Evelyn Mortimer not just a mistress, but the original matriarch of the bloodline. My bloodline. It was undeniable. But proving it wouldn't be enough. The clause still held legal weight, even if it was a fraud. I couldn't win by exposing the truth. I had to weaponize the lie. I enlisted help from outside the family. An old college friend turned documentarian, Alina. She specialized in legacy exposes, usually about corrupt politicians or disgraced CEOs. I offered her exclusive access to the Carringtons under the pretense of making a documentary about modern American dynasties. She arrived with a camera crew and a charming smile that made even Malcolm soften. We began interviews in the drawing room with antique portraits looming behind each subject like silent judges. I fed Alina the necessary narrativist tension, secrets, legacy pressure, but I never revealed the full truth. Not yet. Instead, I let my family do it for me. Ellis, drunk on nostalgia and scotch, let slip that he and Claudia hadn't spoken for 7 years before our grandfather died. Claudia, red-eyed and vindictive, revealed that Malcolm had once tried to have her committed over a misunderstanding about estate documents. Cousins bickered over past slights, inheritance rumors, and who was favored by which parent. Alina captured it all. Hour after hour of dysfunction, manipulation, and fragile civility imploding under the camera's gaze. The footage was raw, ugly, and perfect. Then came the final bait. I staged a family reconciliation dinner. I invited everyone, even the estranged branches. The cousin in rehab, the aunt who sued the family 10 years ago, the nephew who had legally changed his last name to escape the legacy. I promised it would be different. Honest healing. And it was. At first, wine flowed. Lauder echoed. Toasts were made. But midway through the meal, I stood up and proposed a group reading of grandfather's will. Not the legal version. My own, edited and dramatized, complete with invented clauses and fabricated footnotes. I claimed it had been found in a sealed envelope marked Private Testament. I knew it was risky, but I had a theory. If the family believed there were secrets even they didn't know, they'd unravel faster. As I read the false testament aloud, I watched faces contort. Curiosity, confusion, then fear. I claimed that the true heir had already been chosen, that the clause was merely ceremonial, that a document existed naming the child of the concealed union as sole beneficiary. Silence followed. I let it hang. Then I added, I have reason to believe I am that child. That broke them. Malcolm stood red-faced, shouting about lies. Claudia demanded proof. Ellis just laughed and lit a cigarette at the table. But the cousins, the ones not tied to power, listened. They leaned in. The doubt was planted. The tree was splitting at the trunk. Later that night, I released the footage of the family's confessions. Cut, edited it, and paired with ominous music. It went to Alina first, who ensured it reached the right platforms under anonymous submission. The next morning, the Carrington name trended online, not for philanthropy or elegance, but for dysfunction and decay. Sponsors pulled out of deals. Journalists requested interviews. The legacy cracked like stained glass under a hammer. But even then, I wasn't done. I visited the family lawyer, the one who had drafted the will. I showed him the authenticated birth certificate and the chapel letter. His hands trembled slightly as he read. "You understand what this means?" he asked. I nodded. "But I'm not here to contest the will," I said. "I'm here to settle it." He looked confused. "I want you to draw up a new agreement, one that makes me interim executor of the estate, on the condition that I deliver verifiable reconciliation within 30 days. He hesitated. "You'd be assuming personal liability." "I already have," I said. "They just don't know it yet." I walked out of that office with control, not just of the estate, but of the story. In a world where image is legacy, perception is power. The Carringtons were collapsing under the weight of their own lies. And I, the child of the concealed union, was the only one left standing. The clause wasn't about unity. It was about exposure. And with every revelation, I pulled the family closer to the only reconciliation they'd ever achieve. Ruin. The morning after the fabricated testament went public, I woke to silence. Not peaceful silence. No, this was the brittle knife, edge quiet of a world just before collapse. The estate, usually humming with distant footsteps, clinking silverware, and the occasional hum of Claudia's ancient piano, had gone mute. Even the birds outside the stained glass windows of the drawing room had abandoned their morning chorale. I lay still in my bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what I'd done press down on me like an invisible hand. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I'd pulled the right thread, or if I'd just unraveled everything. The emails started flooding in before sunrise. Journalists, lawyers, former family associates, the distant relatives claiming to be concerned stakeholders. The leaked footage had struck a nerve. The rawness of our dysfunction, carefully curated and perfectly timed, was too good to ignore. The Carrington name, once synonymous with refinement and power, had been reduced overnight to a synonym for scandal. And while some cousins fled the chaos by boarding early flights back to their respective cities, Malcolm stayed. So did Claudia and Ellis, which meant the real game wasn't over. It had only just begun. Malcolm came for me first. He didn't knock. He walked straight into my quarters, closed the door gently behind him, and stood like a funeral director preparing to deliver tragic news. "You've made a mess," he said, voice level. "A public one." I didn't respond. I wanted to see how far he'd go without resistance. You think that fake testament and your ghost chasing changes anything? He moved closer. This estate, these businesses, our name, they're built on something older than law. They're built on control. And you've just given that up for what? Attention. He smiled then. A slow, pitying grin. You always were sentimental. That was his mistake. Assuming sentiment was weakness. I reached into the drawer and placed the real birth certificate on the table. Next to it, the authenticated letter from the chapel. That's not sentiment, I said. That's blood. He stared. Just a flicker, but I saw it, the recognition. He knew the documents were real. He didn't ask where I found them. He already knew. You're bluffing, he said, quieter now. Even if it's true, you think you can carry the weight of this legacy. You're a ghost, not a successor. You were never meant to be part of this. I leaned forward. That's where you're wrong. I was always part of it. You just buried me with the others. After he left, I felt the room grow colder, as if some ancient current had shifted direction. Malcolm wasn't going to fight me in boardrooms or courtrooms. He was going to fight me in the dark, with secrets and shadows. That meant I had to move faster. Claudia was next. I found her in the solarium, surrounded by plants she never watered and books she never read. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. You found it, didn't you? She asked. I didn't pretend not to know what she meant. He kept everything, I said, even the tapes. That was a lie. There were no tapes, just my father's journal and the letter. But I needed her afraid, and she was. It was supposed to stay buried, she whispered. We agreed. I didn't ask who Poe was. I already knew. Claudia didn't care about the inheritance. She cared about reputation, about preserving the family image as something more than a historical footnote. But her guilt made her malleable. I told her I needed her help. Publicly. That she would vouch for the legitimacy of the reconciliation. That she'd confirm my lineage, even if only vaguely. In return, I'd ensure the letter didn't make it to the press. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. You always reminded me of your father, she said. Same eyes. Same foolish courage. I wanted to ask what that meant, but she was already lost in some memory too dangerous to name. Ellis, though, was different. He was watching everything unravel with a kind of grim amusement. When I finally cornered him in the cellar, where he'd taken to drinking alone among crates of forgotten wines. He raised a glass to me and said, Congratulations, heir apparent, or is it heir aberrant? I told him what I needed, his silence and his signature on a statement acknowledging the successful moral reconciliation of the family. He laughed for a full minute. You know what the problem with this family is, he said. We mistake truth for resolution. As if bleeding out in public somehow heals the wound. I waited. Eventually, he signed. But if you win, he added, just remember every throne is built on bones. Yours is just fresher than most. With their reluctant cooperation, I submitted the reconciliation documentation to the family's legal trustee. It was symbolic, mostly a bureaucratic step, but legally, it activated the clause. According to the terms, if reconciliation was achieved and verified within a year, the estate would pass to the grandchild who orchestrated it. No one had expected anyone to actually fulfill that requirement. That was the point. It was a trap designed to delay, distract, and disguise the real theft that Malcolm had orchestrated decades ago. But by walking straight into the trap and disarming it, I'd turned it into a lever. The lawyer reviewed everything. He asked questions, nodded gravely, and finally said, If no formal challenges are raised in the next 72 hours, the estate will transfer. And then the letters came. Anonymous, typed, postmarked from various cities. Each one accusing me of coercion, fraud, manipulation. Some had photocopies of forged documents. Others claimed I had blackmailed Ellis, bribed Claudia, or worse. It was a smear campaign, sloppy but effective. The trustee froze the process. Pending investigation, I knew immediately Malcolm. He was throwing ink in the water, trying to drown the truth in procedural delay. So I countered the only way I could. Transparency. Elena released the second phase of the documentary. This time, it wasn't just about dysfunction. It was about lineage, legacy, proof. I appeared on camera, presenting the birth certificate, the authenticated letter, and excerpts from my father's journal. I laid it all bare. My connection to Evelyn Mortimer, the adoption, the hidden clause. The footage was brutal, vulnerable, real, and it worked. The public turned. The narrative shifted. I wasn't the usurper anymore. I was the heir reclaiming what was stolen. But the twist, the one I hadn't planned, came from outside. A woman named Maura, early 40s, sharp eyes. She contacted me through Elena, claiming to have known Evelyn, claimed to have been her nurse during her final years. We met in a quiet cafe far from the estate. She brought a shoebox of letters, dozens of them, all from Evelyn to Lionel. Some never sent, some returned unopened. In one, Evelyn wrote, "He doesn't know yet, but I will raise him alone if I must. I will not let him grow up among wolves." Another, dated the day after my father's adoption was finalized, "You've taken him, but I will not disappear. Blood remembers." But the last letter, undated, unsent, was different. It was to me. "If you ever find this, know that I loved you, that your father was not taken. He was saved. The Carringtons didn't adopt him. They reclaimed him. I let them. I had to. They threatened more than my name, and beneath it, scrawled in faint blue ink, a name I'd never seen before. A name that changed everything. A second child. Another heir. I stared at it, heart thundering. Another. Was this the real reason my father had kept everything hidden? Not to protect himself, but to protect someone else. Someone who, if found, could challenge everything. Maura looked at me gently. She never told anyone who the second child was, only that he was hidden in plain sight. I asked the obvious question. "Is he still alive?" Maura nodded. "He's closer than you think." And just like that, the ground shifted beneath me again. I thought I had reached the summit, that I had pulled the last veil from the Carrington legacy. But now I saw it clearly. I wasn't the conclusion. I was the prelude. There was still someone out there, someone with equal claim, maybe even greater. And if they knew what I had done, what I had set into motion, they might not come as a brother. They might come as a rival. For 3 nights, I didn't sleep. I tried to convince myself it was the pressure, the unresolved legal freeze, the weight of orchestrating a lie so intricate that I'd started to lose sight of where performance ended and identity began. But in truth, I couldn't sleep because of the name. A single line scrawled in a dead woman's final letter, barely legible beneath her shaky farewell, had detonated every illusion I thought I controlled. A second child. Another heir, and worse, hidden in plain sight. That meant he'd been near me all along, buried within the lattice of cousins, half-cousins, step-siblings, and legacy strays who rotated through the estate like interchangeable parts. One of them wasn't just blood. He was threat. The name Evelyn had written was incomplete. Just a first name, Julian. No last name. No photograph. I cross-referenced every Julian connected to the Carringtons in the past 50 years. Nothing direct. But then I remembered something strange from my father's journal, an entry scrawled in the margin of a page titled .1978, the year everything shifted. There, between cryptic references to Malcolm's offshore accounts and Claudia's nervous breakdown, was a line that chilled me when I read it again. E insisted J be placed with her, not with the others. Said it was the only way to keep the blood clean. Asked me never to tell anyone, not even him. It was as though the final piece had always been there, hiding in the corner of the puzzle, waiting to be noticed. My father knew about Julian. He helped place him somewhere, protected him. But in the journal, who was she? Who did Evelyn trust more than the Carringtons, more than herself? To raise a child meant to be invisible. I scoured records but found nothing useful. No guardianship filings, no adoptions under the Mortimer or Carrington names. That meant one thing. The child had been passed through unofficial hands, likely under a different identity. hidden not just in plain sight, but within our family under a different truth. That week, I began watching everyone differently, not with suspicion, though there was plenty of that, but with a question thrumming beneath each encounter. Could it be him? There was Parker, the quiet son of Malcolm's second wife, who'd always seemed oddly disconnected from the Carrington competition. There was Daniel, Claudia's godson, raised practically on the estate but never once shown interest in the inheritance. And then there was Nathaniel, my cousin, or so I'd thought, the only child of a late aunt, Rebecca, who died when we were both in our teens. We'd grown up together, played in the orchard, swam in the lake, even shared a room one summer during the renovations. I remembered something my father once said after watching us bicker. "You two are like twins. Same fire, same shadow behind the eyes." Back then, it was just a comment. Now, it echoed like prophecy. I invited Nathaniel for coffee on the pretense of discussing the reconciliation fallout. He showed up casual as always, hoodie, boots, a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. But there was something in his eyes when I mentioned Evelyn Mortimer. Not recognition. Something worse, avoidance. He stirred his cup slowly, watching the spoon instead of me. "Can't say I've heard the name," he said, too quickly. I nodded. Let the silence stretch. "My father helped place a child once," I said. "Someone the family wasn't supposed to know about." Nathaniel looked up then. "Dead on. And now you want to drag that ghost into the spotlight." His voice was steady but tight. I shrugged. Ghosts tend to dig their own way out. That night, I found the first real confirmation. I broke into the East Wing archives, where my grandfather kept hard copies of birth records, estate dealings, and classified family correspondences. It took hours digging through dust and the scent of mildew, but finally I found a ledger of estate guests from 1981. There, nestled between guests from Harvard and names of foreign dignitaries, was a 3-week entry for Rebecca Carrington and infant Julian. My hands went cold. Rebecca, my dead aunt. She'd raised him, no formal adoption needed. Just a quiet agreement sealed by blood and silence. Nathaniel was Julian, and he didn't know. The realization hit like a landslide. I sat back, trying to grasp the implications. Nathaniel had no idea he wasn't Rebecca's biological child, that he was Evelyn's second son, that he, too, had a claim. Not just on the inheritance, but on the very story I'd carefully rewritten around myself. I had two options. Tell him, risk everything, or bury the truth, just like the generation before me had done. But I wasn't like them. I didn't believe in false order. I believed in controlled chaos. If I was going to win, truly win, I couldn't just silence Julian. I had to make him choose not to challenge me. So I invited him for a walk. We took the forest trail behind the estate, the one we'd hiked as children, pretending to be knights or hunters or kings. Halfway through, I stopped and handed him a small envelope. Inside are a copy of the 1981 guest ledger, the letter from Evelyn to the second son, a photo of her in the red coat, cradling an infant. He said nothing for a long time. Then, softly, "Why are you giving me this?" I looked him in the eye. "Because you deserve to know who you are, and because I need you to understand why I'm still the one who should lead this family." We sat on a fallen tree, the woods quiet except for distant wind. He read everything again, then turned to me. This makes me your uncle." I laughed. Short, bitter. Something like that. "And Evelyn, she was my mother." His voice cracked. I didn't answer. He knew. "So why now?" he asked. "Why not keep it hidden like everyone else did?" I sighed. "Because I've learned something in all this. Legacy isn't about blood, it's about narrative. And right now, that narrative is fragile. If we fight over it, we both lose. But if we tell it right together, we both win." He stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he handed back the envelope. "I don't want it," he said. "The title, the estate, the press, you think it's power. I think it's poison." He stood, brushing bark from his jeans. But if I find out you're using my mother's name to rewrite your own history, if this is some ploy, I'll burn the whole house down." You understand me?" I nodded. Completely. That night, I had Alina prepare the final cut of the documentary. This one would close the loop. The world had seen the Carringtons at their worst. Now, they would see a story of hidden lineage, painful reunions, and redemption. I included Evelyn's letter. I included the truth about Julian. But I left out his name. Let the mystery remain. Let the world wonder. The Carringtons would survive not because of transparency, but because of the myth, a rebranded dynasty. A Phoenix story, and I would be its face. The final twist came quietly, 2 days before the legal freeze was set to lift. Malcolm vanished. No calls. No letters. Just an empty wing, a discarded glass of brandy, and a missing drawer of family documents. I wasn't surprised. He knew he'd lost. He was old money's last gasp in a digital age. His era was over. Mine had begun. Or so I thought, because just before the estate transferred, I received one final message. Hand-delivered. No return address. Inside was a photograph of Evelyn, different from the others. She was older, frailer, standing beside a teenage boy. Not Nathaniel. A boy with different eyes. On the back, a note in Evelyn's handwriting. Only one of them was mine. The other was always yours. I stared at it, my mind racing. There was a third. In that moment, time didn't slow. It stopped entirely. The photograph in my hand shook, not from wind or cold, but from something deeper, something primal. The woman I had come to view as the linchpin of a buried dynasty, Evelyn Mortimer, stood in that frozen image with a frail but composed grace. Her hand rested on the shoulder of a boy perhaps 14 or 15. Tall, angular, eyes too sharp for his age. He didn't resemble anyone in the family. Not Nathaniel. Not Ellis. And on the back, just 9 words penned in the fading hand of the ghost who had started all this. Only one of them was mine. The other was always yours? Yours. I read that word again and again. At first, I told myself she meant it in the metaphorical sense. Perhaps the boy was a ward, a stray, someone my father or grandfather had taken under the family's wing. But the way the photo had been sent, anonymous, perfectly timed, right before the estate's transition, it reeked of intention. Someone knew. Someone was reminding me that I had not finished uncovering the rot in the Carrington foundation. And worse, that I might be standing on the wrong floor altogether. I searched for the photo's metadata, scanned it, ran facial recognition through every available channel. Nothing. No match. It was as though the boy in the photo didn't exist. A ghost framed in grain and shadow. I cross-referenced the time period. Judging by Evelyn's age and attire, it had to be the late 90s, maybe 2000. That was nearly 2 decades after Julian's supposed birth. Was this boy another sibling? A second son? Or something else entirely? I returned to the archives. This time not just for records, but for letters, diaries, guest logs, anything that hinted at visits or disappearances. And I found it in Claudia's 2002 planner, wedged in a drawer beneath stacks of empty envelopes. Evelyn visit noon, bring the boy. Must not be seen. L. is unaware. L. Lionel. My grandfather. So Evelyn had returned to the estate long after my father's adoption. And she brought this boy. Why? Why in secret? And why did Claudia know? Claudia. She was the only one left who had touched every part of this secret. She had known about my father's true parentage. She had signed off on the adoption. She had seen Julian. And now, it seemed she had met this boy. This third, unknown, this cipher who threatened to unravel everything. I found her in the sitting room, hunched over a book she hadn't turned a page in for hours. She didn't look up when I entered. "I need to ask you something," I said. Her eyes stayed fixed on the book. "You already know the answer," she murmured. "You just want me to confirm it so you can blame me when the truth burns." Who was the boy in the photo? She finally looked at me. "He was Evelyn's mistake," she said. "Or maybe yours, or maybe his." "His?" I asked. "You mean Lionel?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I mean your father." The breath left my lungs. "My father," I whispered. "He had another child." Claudia closed the book, her fingers trembling. "Not officially, not legally, but yes, there was a girl. Brief, secretive, She didn't belong to our world. He loved her anyway, until Evelyn found out. And when she did, she took the child. Said she would raise him in the same silence we forced on her. Said it was the only justice left to her. I tried to process that. So the boy in the photo is my brother. Claudia didn't answer. Why didn't anyone say anything? I asked, my voice rising. Why didn't my father tell me? Because he didn't know, Claudia said softly. He never knew she kept him. He thought the child died. I staggered back. Evelyn had lied, or manipulated, or both. She had raised my brother in secret, just as she had handed Julian to Rebecca. One hidden in plain sight, the other in shadow. 2 hairs from 2 branches. And me, straddling both lines with a foot on ground that was now actively collapsing. And then the final blow. I received another envelope. No handwriting this time, just a printed card inside that said, "You are not the last Carrington. You were never even the first." Attached was a single page. A copy of an amended will, unsigned but on authentic Carrington letterhead, dated just 3 months before Lionel's death. It read, "In light of recent revelations concerning the extended Mortimer line and descendants outside formal recognition, I hereby designate that upon my passing, the estate and all associated trusts be re-evaluated to include the offspring of Jonathan Carrington, regardless of public record or legitimacy, for they are, by blood, true inheritors of my legacy." The paper burned like acid in my hands. Lionel had known, not just about me, about all of us, and he had tried in the last gasp of his empire to open the doors he had spent decades bolting shut. But the will had never been signed. It had been buried. Probably by Malcolm, or Ellis, or Claudia. I didn't know. But someone had stopped it. Someone had ensured that the lie remained. Until now, there was no more pretense. I couldn't spin this. Couldn't frame it for Elena's lens. The truth was now louder than the myth I'd constructed. If I didn't act, everything would be taken from me. Not by force, but by legitimacy. Julian had declined the throne. But what about this third boy? My brother, the true bloodline of Jonathan Carrington. If he surfaced now, at the height of public scrutiny, the court of opinion would crown him before I could speak a word. I had to find him. I started with Claudia. She gave me the only lead she had, a name Evelyn once mentioned in passing. Rowan. No last name, just Rowan. He was quiet, she said. Serious, loved books. Would stare at the stars for hours. He reminded me of Jonathan when he was young. That same intensity, that same loneliness. I searched databases, ran queries, checked school records in surrounding counties. Finally, a match. Rowan Hart, age 24, graduated from a modest liberal arts college upstate. Recently published a poetry collection titled Inheritance in Silence. The title hit me like a slap. I read it in one sitting. Each poem was like a puzzle piece drenched in metaphor but reeking of truth. One in particular stood out. Thee named me a myth erased in the shadow of giant Sid, but I was born of fire, the kind that turns portraits to ash. I knew them. I had found him. I didn't contact him directly. Not yet. I attended one of his readings, sitting quietly in the back as he spoke to a room of strangers who didn't realize they were listening to the person who could shatter an empire with a sentence. He looked like Evelyn in the eyes, but he had my father's jaw, my hands. After the reading, he stood alone outside the venue, smoking a cigarette like he was trying to turn breath into steam. I walked up to him slowly, holding nothing but the photograph Evelyn had sent. He saw it, froze, and said, "I wondered when you'd find me." We didn't talk much that night. Just enough. He knew who he was. He had known for years. Evelyn had told him everything. But she had made him promise, never seek the Carringtons. Let them come to you. Let them be the ones who crawl to the past. I never wanted the estate, Rowan said. I just wanted the truth to be louder than their lies. I offered him a choice. Come with me, I said. Let's tell this story together, as it is. No edits, no spin, just the truth. 2 sons of a dead man, rising not to claim a throne, but to bury one. He smoked in silence for a while, then nodded once. I'll come, he said. but I won't save you from what comes next, duh. And as I walked away, I knew he was right, because the sixth and final part of the Carrington legacy wasn't mine to write. It was his. It began with silence, as all endings do. Not the kind of silence that comforts, but the kind that follows an explosion. The kind where every particle in the air has been changed, where everything is holding its breath to see what's left standing. After my meeting with Rowan, I didn't return to the estate immediately. I drove for hours, aimlessly, through back roads and rural towns that had never heard of the Carringtons, places where legacy didn't matter and silence wasn't weaponized. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see Evelyn sitting there, nodding, whispering some last cryptic line to remind me that she'd always known this moment would come. But there was no ghost, just Rowan's poetry book on the seat, open to a dog-eared page titled Here. By the time I returned to the estate, it was already happening. Elena had received an anonymous drop, video footage, letters, and a signed statement from Rowan himself. In it, he confirmed his parentage, detailed his upbringing under Evelyn's care, and acknowledged his brother me. Not as rival, not as enemy, but as kin. The statement ended with a line that hit like scripture. This was never about inheritance. It was about history correcting itself. Elena, sharp as ever, turned it into the closing scene of the final episode of the documentary. It dropped the next morning. And when it did, the world shifted. The reaction was nuclear. Legacy media called it the most shocking dynasty unraveling of the century. The internet devoured it, frame by frame. The Carrington name, once sanitized by press teams and estate handlers, was now raw, bleeding, human. But the twist wasn't just in the revelation of Rowan. It was in how he handled it. He didn't claim the estate, didn't demand money or power. He didn't even step onto the estate grounds. Instead, he issued a public statement. Let the house crumble. Let the myth end. What was built on lies should not be passed down but buried. That afternoon, the lawyers called. The trustee who had spent months navigating our family's chaos sounded different now. Lighter. Your brother's renunciation changes the equation, he said. With Julian out, and Rowan refusing claim, you're the last viable heir. But given the damage to the Carrington name, we're recommending a restructuring. You could dissolve the trust, liquidate the assets, start fresh. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the stained glass window of the great room, the one that cast light like spilled wine across the marble floor. For generations, that window had been the symbol of Carrington permanence. Now, it felt like a relic of a lie too tired to stand anymore. I walked through the house that evening, alone. No Malcolm, no Claudia, no Ellis. They had scattered like leaves in wind, retreating into silence, shame, or irrelevance. The rooms echoed with the ghosts of performances we had all given. Every mirror reflected versions of us that no longer existed. I stopped in the study, my father's study, and opened the journal one last time. Near the end, I found an entry I had missed, dated 2 weeks before his death. It read, "If the truth survives me, let it set fire to everything. Better ashes than silence." I closed the book. 3 days later, I gathered the remaining family on the estate lawn. Only 6 of us came, those too stubborn or curious to stay away. I stood on the steps, holding the letter from Lionel, the photograph of Evelyn and the unnamed child, and the new documentation that officially named me executor of what remained. I said nothing for several minutes. Just held the items up, one by one. Let them look, let them understand. Then I said, "It's over." But there was no applause, no outcry, just a collective release, like breath after years of holding it in. I dissolved the trust, not all of it. Some funds were relocated to charities Evelyn had quietly supported, places where forgotten children were given voices. The estate itself was deeded to a historical preservation society under strict conditions. It would never be lived in again. Only visited, like a ruin, a warning. I offered each family member the option to walk away clean. Most did. Ellis wrote me a postcard from Argentina 6 months later. Claudia sent a single check to a literacy foundation, then vanished. Malcolm was never heard from again. I assume he found some corner of the world that still traded in old names and older money. And Rowan, he came back once. It was spring. The orchard was blooming again, white petals falling like snow. He arrived without announcement, dressed in black, holding a small box. We stood under the tree we used to climb as boys. Though we hadn't known we were brothers then, he handed me the box. Inside were Evelyn's ashes. She didn't want to be buried, he said. Said the ground at the estate already held too many lies. We scattered them in silence. No prayers, no eulogy, just wind. As he turned to go, I asked him, "What did you let me keep it? The estate? The story, all of it?" He paused. "Because I never wanted a kingdom," he said. "I wanted to end one." He left without looking back. In the months that followed, I moved into a modest apartment in the city. No staff, no portraits, just books. One of them was Rowan's, his second collection titled House of Glass. In the dedication, he wrote "For the brother who found me, and for the truth that found us both." I read that line often. Sometimes I dream of the estate, but not how it was. I see it crumbling, ivy devouring its walls, the stained glass window shattered and bleeding color into the dirt. And always, standing among the ruins, are three figures: a woman in a red coat, a boy with my father's jaw, and me. Sometimes they speak, but mostly they watch. And I wake knowing that I am no longer carrying the Carrington legacy. I buried it. And what rose in its place was not a family. It was freedom. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe and like the video.